Day 516 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia is sitting on more than 242,000 military personnel losses, making for an additional 660 Russian losses in the past 24 hours alone. Then as for hardware, 11 tanks, 13 APVs and 17 artillery, making for a lot of double-digit numbers there, which is certainly indicative of assault operations underway on the map. Then, as for the map, we'll start out in Moscow, as allegedly we have a report from the Russian government stating that a Ukrainian UAV attack was carried out on a building of Russia's GRU, which is their main intelligence directorate, which is in downtown Moscow. But something seems out of place here. First of all, Russia would, by implication, be admitting that they can't defend their own capital that's roughly 1,000 kilometers away from Ukraine. Or perhaps this is as a result of a local anti-war partisan group deciding to take target with this Russian FSB-style building and hit it with something instead. Because partisan acts like these have happened quite a bit before in Russia since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which therefore usually causes Russian propaganda to have to strike back and save face, most importantly, by calling it something else, for instance in this case a Ukrainian hit. But having said all that, I don't rule out it actually being a Ukrainian hit, and if it was, well, that's actually quite impressive. Then we'll head down and touch on Russia's Belgorod Oblast momentarily, as the governor of the region recently stated that a border town on the Russian side was fired on by Ukrainian cluster munitions, which I find highly unlikely. Also, the Belgorod governor said there was no casualties and no damage, and didn't provide any proof of anything happening either. It's almost as if the Belgorod governor was provided talking points direct from the Kremlin. Then we'll head down to the Ukrainian map today, as Russian forces in the most northern regions of Kharkiv and Luhansk are still pretty hell-bent on creating some bridgeheads west of occupied Svartova, as they have launched assaults over the past 3 days on the Svartova-Crimean front line, which is all likely an attempt to take the remainder of Luhansk back, which, by the way, was once upon a time actually occupied by Russia around this time last year. But of course, they lost segments of it, as you can somewhat see here, during the successful Kharkiv counteroffensive, all in green, as indicated on the map. And so the prevalent theory here goes that Russia wants to ideally create a defensive buffer all the way to the Oskil River, and probably no further, because as we now know, the Russian army has had some significant difficulty crossing rivers with ease. Then also nearby, Ukrainian artillery from the 54th Brigade destroyed a large ammunition dump of the Russian forces just west of Lysychansk, which is certainly ideal for the AFU in terms of hampering Russia weapon supplies to the north. Then moving down to the southern Bakhmut axis, as Russian sources themselves have reported that the AFU reached very close to Avdiivka, which in fact ties in with our previous reporting that the AFU of the 57th and the 3rd is advancing from 2 tree lines away. Plus, just nearby, Russian sources also reported fighting in the southwestern outskirts of Klishchivka, which is pretty consistent with the map's oinky pig indication of the defending Russian forces south of to this settlement. Oh, and I'll swing back north for a moment, as Ukrainian FPV loitering munitions continue to swarm anything that moves in the area. And you'll see on the video, we're dealing with multiple Russian losses at just the one location, which is quite a ways back from the front contact point, really. And it never ceases to amaze me this happening, especially as we've actually had some old footage I've shown you before in the past 1 and 2 months ago of the same mop-up crew at this very same intersection, the one with the hut, as I like to call it. Oh, plus, perhaps most importantly, there is some really early reports that the AFU has officially entered Bakhmut for the takeback. But we'll have to wait and see what information comes out on that one upcoming soon. Then moving a bit further south, so Russian units in Avdiivka came under heavy fire from Ukrainian sources, losing a couple of armored vehicles, Russian armored vehicles, pieces in the process. So just another day in the Avdiivka surrounds, which is a Russian armored graveyard of a location due to Ukraine having had the opportunity to fortify defensive positions in this very region since Russia's Donbass invasion way back in 2014. Then in somewhat nearby Marinka, so Ukrainian FPV drones are at it again, this time taking out a Russian BMP-3 with a massive explosion as the ammunition on board made easy work of exploding and absolutely tearing the vehicle apart. As those Russian ammunition chambers on their medium and heavy armor are just not separated sufficiently from the rest of the vehicle. Then we'll head on down south to the Zaporizhzhia front for the most part here, as the AFU progressed further into the grey zone, roughly 3 kilometers southeast of Kamianska, although not exactly at all reflected on the map here. Then right next door, heavy fighting continues in the direction of Robotian. And this has been happening over the past few days with armoured units of the Ukrainian forces reaching the northeastern outskirts to later be beaten back by the Russian forces. Nighttime shelling and sniping occurs, and there is somewhat of a gridlock in this area right now. But we have received some recent footage of a Ukrainian column consisting of Leopard 2 tanks and Bradley M2s coming under artillery fire while pushing through enemy territory. And this footage has been confirmed as at the very same Orikhiv axis, just north of Robotyne, all where some of the heaviest fighting is happening right now. But I would like to say there's definitely an improvement in armoured vehicle space in here for the Ukrainian forces, which tripped up one such Ukrainian unit much earlier last month during their assault operations. Then I'd like to show in this photo, we see a Ukrainian Tor SAM crew member performing damage control after a Russian Lancet loitering munitions strike. Also in the region, a destroyed Russian 203mm 2S7 Pion heavy artillery position was noted in the south and very likely taken out by precision HIMARS strikes. Then briefly, we'll move to the Kherson left bank as a counter-battery fight is currently, or should I say, still underway. And a lot of this is happening on the south bank of the Dnipro River, near or around to Oleshki, as some elements of the Ukrainian army, shall we say, are in fact positioned on the south, and even the map to some degree represents that as well. So as a result, Ukraine's Operational Command South spokesperson said that the AFU is currently in operations to clear certain south of the river territory, which they will then be able to take over without endangering the lives of soldiers. And this is generally the point of difference for the Ukrainian forces over the Russian forces. They effectively do the math on what assault tactics will, or if they'll limit or any risk of soldiers' life endangerment. As opposed to Russia, that time and time again has been seen as taking much more of an under-planned meat grinder approach to attacks. Then we'll head on down south to the occupied Crimean Peninsula. So yet another ammo dump was taken out in occupied Crimea, and that's the second one in as many days. This time, it occurred in Jankoy and forced the closure of the railway traffic to Sevastopol. So I'll zoom out for a bit of better context here. And as you can see on the map, indicated by the white lines, is the logistical train lines that Russia uses to support its war. And of course, as you can see there, Jankoy is an extremely important centralized logistical hub for railway routes in all major directions. And since the Russian war machine heavily relies on railway logistics to support its war efforts, events like these, particularly for Crimea, are an extremely or extensively heavy blow to the Russian military. Then we'll head across to some news for today, start off with some hardware updates. So Britain handed over to Ukraine several dozen Wolfram mobile ground platforms for their Brimstone missiles. And we normally think of the Brimstone missiles as being air-launched missiles, but certainly they can be launched from these ground-based platforms as well, albeit usually with a little less range when firing from the ground as opposed to being air-launched. Then in some other news, this is more of a training footage of a Ukrainian FPV loitering munition operator at a training ground, with this individual unit modified to drop smaller 40mm munitions. Oh, and just as a reminder, FPV stands for first person view, thus meaning these FPV drones are usually used in combination with a VR headset. So talk about your modern warfare. And this particular setup is fairly interesting as the drone makes a steep dive before releasing the munition with relative accuracy. And then moving on to a different kind of a hardware update, 2 damaged Leopard 2 A4s were spotted yesterday at a mechanical plant in southern Poland for repairs, with very deliberate photos showing the plant entrance. And so sometimes I do wonder, could Russia even do something like this in terms of maintenance and repair? And the probable answer is generally not, given that their tanks are more susceptible to outright destruction from strikes as opposed to NATO-provided tanks. As you might remember from a moment ago, me speaking about the unseparated munition storage locations for the heavy armor. But also in many cases, Russian tankies simply abandon their tanks after a non-critical drone hit on the tank's hull, which we've got a lot of footage for, as they are presumably undertrained tankies and just decide to abandon ship. But more importantly to that, they simply leave the tank hatches open in the process, allowing Ukrainian loitering drone operators to finish off the job. And then even then, on top of that, not to mention you need sufficient towing capacity for about 60 tons of steel to take it back for repairs. And Russia really hasn't ever demonstrated this capability. After all, a derailed 60-ton tank won't tow itself. Then in some other news, Belarusian President Lukashenko met with Putin in St. Petersburg in the last day, for the first time since Uncle Luka helped Putin to broker a deal to end the Prigozhin mutiny from late last month. And it was a very odd or bizarre meeting, as you might in fact expect these days, as Uncle Luka said that the Wagner forces that are now staged in Belarus are in a bad mood and just itching to invade Poland. But also that Wagner were asking Uncle Luka for permission to do so as well. But the problem is, Wagner forces are only about 5,000 in number, as they're staged in Belarus there, so this is unlikely for Wagner to choose to invade Poland, and therefore face the collective might of NATO and its Article 5 security guarantees for all included nations. And I don't even know where to start on how unsuccessful that kind of military engagement would be for the Wagner forces. But then back to Cheech and Chong over here, the false narratives between these two are seemingly never ending, as they also stated that Poland has territorial ambitions of forcefully transferring Western Ukraine into its own Polish territory, and that Russia and Belarus should protect Ukraine from evil Poland now. So, this is the insanity we get out of some world leaders today. So, if you always thought you disliked reality TV shows, perhaps then I seek to disabuse you of that notion, as this is reality TV at its finest, folks. So the two leaders ended the day stating they would extend the meeting for a second day and to discuss, quote, security in our region, despite not realizing the main security issues in the region being as a direct result of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And as a result of that, every issue that has since spawned for them. Then as for a lighter segment, so here's a nice video of a Ukrainian BMP-1 that got some free sunflower camouflage in its travels. Of course, I guess one has to question just exactly how those sunflowers received nourishment and came into being in the first place, which makes the lighter segment a little bit darker than originally intended. Then we'll move across to a funny to round off the day with, guys. So now for this next funny, it's perhaps only funny from a more overarching objective standpoint as it pertains to Russian desperation. As the content itself, I don't necessarily consider funny, but here we go anyway. So Russia is now recruiting women for its territorial defense units on the border with Ukraine. And so here we have an all-female unit undergoing their border defense military training. And to my surprise, Russian state media TV actually broadcast this, speaking with several women who were self-confessed teachers, hairdressers, and even childcare workers. Now, before these female forces existed, volunteer male Russian forces existed instead, who actually, they constantly complained about getting no equipment and no support for their positions. But based on this new update, there's a chance many of those fellas were since recruited to the front lines. And out of all of this, all I really want to say is just stop. Just stop, Russia. At what point do you consider your country to have reached rock bottom? So I guess going to these lengths isn't a big enough hint for you. Russia, you're engaged in the biggest military conflict or war in Europe since World War II, and you're turning yourself into a disgrace of a country with each and every new day. So that'll be it for today, guys. I'm unlikely to be in tomorrow, but don't you worry, I'll always be back shortly thereafter. So thanks again for watching, liking, and commenting, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.